Glad to be with you again after that short break, and it's time for us to move on from Congress and the administration to discussing the next storage horizon at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I am personally quite eager to discuss the agency's agenda for 2021 and how a wide range of topics will affect the future of storage in the power sector. And so for this discussion, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back to the forum now Chairman Richard Glick. Before his nomination to FERC in 2017, Chairman Glick was General Counsel for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee Democrats, serving as a key policy advisor on numerous power sector and markets issues. He's also an alumnus of the power sector himself, having worked for several utilities and independent power producers. And just 2 weeks ago, President Biden appointed him the chairman of the commission. And so I am very honored he's spending time with us in the storage industry as one of his first public engagements. Welcome, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jason. And I really appreciate the invite from the Energy Storage Association, but also kind words from you, Jason. I've enjoyed working with you over the last several years and look forward to continuing to do that. As Jason mentioned, I've been at FERC for a little over 3 years. I've been chair for about 2 weeks, actually about 2 weeks, really tomorrow morning. But nonetheless, it's I think it's been a pretty good for 2 weeks. I think FERC hasn't made too many errors, hopefully, and I haven't had to dissent on one order. So I'm actually glad to say that. That isn't usually the case in a 2-week period. But seriously, I've really enjoyed my time at FERC in large part because I get to work on very fascinating issues as this country is in the middle of a transition to a clean energy future. And these issues are very wide ranging and important and we take them seriously, but it's also just a lot of fun to be able to work on them. And, in the past, when we were speaking about the transition to a clean energy future and greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the electric sector and so on, the focus has primarily been on, zero emissions generation, whether it be renewable generation or nuclear power or something like that. But clearly, energy storage is now playing a much bigger role, is a much bigger factor in that particular debate or that particular discussion. And I was looking at some statistics the other day, and I realized that you all are expected to add 4 gigawatts of energy storage to the grid in the coming year. And I know that's just the start. I mean, obviously the numbers keep on going up, and we've seen it in other industries, seen it in wind, seen it in solar. We're clearly going to see it in storage too, that you're going to play a much bigger role in adding new generation to the grid or new resources to the grid. And obviously storage plays an important role, not just because it provides a clean source of energy potentially, but also because it addresses reliability issues. It certainly addresses one of the biggest issues we face on the grid, which is intermittency and the concern about inconsistent generation. Sometimes when it's windy or when the sun shines, and obviously when it's not windy or when the sun doesn't shine, we need to address those issues. And storage is a perfect companion for that. And certainly we see that among renewable energy generators, that they see storage as a very important partner. I saw, again, another statistic the other day that I think 2/3 of all new solar generation coming online, solar project coming online, are paired with storage. And that's because, again, the reliability benefits, the efficiency benefits, obviously there's opportunities for arbitrage and so on, but there's certainly significant benefits associated with that. And I think, again, I think you all, you know this already, but you all have a very, very bright future. And I've seen, I was speaking with Jason earlier, and I was, saying that I've seen a number of articles written about FERC lately, and people were talking about how FERC is going to play an enormous role as the country, especially the federal government, tries to address greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And certainly, I think we're going to play a role, and hopefully an important role as we move forward. But I want to temper people's expectations a little bit. I think most people realize that from a perspective of emissions limits or emissions reductions, other agencies like EPA or others certainly have the role there. Or with regard to setting a cap and trade program or carbon pricing, that's primarily going to come either from Congress or the state legislatures. And so, but our role, I think, is important. Our role really is to essentially allow these markets, these energy markets around the country to flourish. And we've certainly seen the demand for clean energy, whether it be from big industrial customers or big commercial customers, but certainly even at the consumer level and certainly at the utility level as well. There's enormous demand for clean energy. And our role is to make sure that whatever market rules there are don't act as barriers to those particular technologies, whether it be storage, whether it be renewable energy. And I think that's certainly something we need to address. Secondly, I think we need to address other rules on the other interstate energy market rules that could potentially impede the growth of energy, such as transmission. I'll get to those issues in a second. What I thought I might do, and hopefully it'll be helpful, is outline 4 priorities that I'd like to see the Commission move forward with that address this whole as the country moves forward to a greener grid. What FERC can do to help out, essentially, in 4 particular priorities. I want to make it clear that even though I'm listing 4 priorities, I have a lot more than 4 priorities for the Commission, but I don't think we want to be here all day listening to me talk about the many priorities that we have. But I will list the top 4, if that's okay, as it relates to this particular subject. And the first one is eliminating barriers, as I mentioned a second ago. And I think the Commission's done a pretty good job of that over the last decade or so, under a variety of different chairs, whether with regard to demand response, with regard to energy efficiency, intermittent generation, and more recently, and I think more interest probably to this association, I think the Commission issued 2 orders over the last several years that I think are going to have a significant impact in terms of removing the barriers to energy storage participation and other technologies. First one, Order 841, I think people are probably familiar with, that the Commission issued several years ago, which essentially requires RTOs and ISOs around the country to facilitate the participation of energy storage facilities in the RTO ISO wholesale markets around the country. And I think we're pretty far along that path. I know we still have some issues with regard to compliance that we're still working our way through, and I certainly can't talk about some of those specific items because they're pending before the Commission. But in general, I think we've made significant progress there, and I'm hoping that you all agree with that. Secondly, more recently, and again, I think something you're aware of, FERC issued Order 2222. And that particular order requires, again, RTOs and ISOs around the country to facilitate participation for aggregated distributed energy resources, which often includes storage around the country, to participate in their wholesale markets. And I think we're in the compliance phase of that right now, and hopefully we'll move forward with that pretty quickly. But that opens up a whole new set of opportunities for cleaner energy technologies, and including energy storage, that we're pretty excited about. And again, I think the Commission has done a very good job there. If there's one thing I would like to do a little bit more on those particular fronts, and with regard to eliminating barriers altogether, is that we focus quite a bit, the Commission's orders have focused quite a bit on regional markets, organized markets, the RTO and ISO markets around the country. And certainly there's a lot of opportunity there. But there's also big parts of the country that aren't served by RTOs and ISOs. The West, the good part of the West outside of California, and certainly the Southeastern United States as well. And I'd like to see if we can explore some of the issues with regard to those particular regions and those particular markets in terms of assessing whether there's more we can do in terms of addressing some of the barriers to storage and other technologies in those markets as well. So hopefully we'll take a look at that. The second item I think I'd like to prioritize is addressing the mandatory capacity markets in the 3 Eastern RTOs, New York, New England, and PJM. I think people are probably very familiar, and I can't speak about specific cases, but people are probably very familiar with the fact that over the last several years, the majority of commissioners at FERC have opted for an approach in these capacity markets that essentially disadvantages technologies that have been the subject of state clean energy programs, state efforts to subsidize or promote those technologies. Those particular technologies have been put at a disadvantage in favor of older, less efficient technologies, generation plants that have been propped up by, I think, the Commission's rules in allowing for these MOPRs, these programs essentially limiting the ability of cleaner technologies and subsidized technologies to bid into the markets at the price they would want to bid in at. And that causes a whole bunch of inefficiencies. In addition to that, raises prices for consumers. And it's something I think we need to take a look at. Now, the good news is that even though I've been outvoted on this issue at the commission, I think around the country and those particular markets in particular, and certainly among the state regulators and state legislatures that are concerned about this, there's a growing understanding, that basically these markets, these particular programs don't have a long life in the future, in large part because people realize they're just not sustainable. These markets can't sustain these particular policies. One, because it raises prices excessively, and I think causes a lot of concern among state regulators. States are saying, why should I allow my utility to be in an RTO if all they're going to do is block my efforts to promote a movement towards cleaner energy? And that's certainly affected, wind and solar, but it's affected storage in a great deal in some of the orders that we've issued in the last several years. And I think we need to take a serious look at that. I'm confident that we will. I'm actually confident that these regions as well will work on an alternative approach, because again, it's just not sustainable. The third item I wanted to briefly mention is transmission. It's hard to mention transmission in a brief way, but I'm a big fan of distributed energy resources. I'm a big fan of energy efficiency, demand response. They're going to play an enormous role in our transition towards a cleaner energy future, but they're not going to be able to do it alone. If we're really going to achieve the goals that have been set out for clean energy and clean electricity in particular, we're going to have to access the tremendous resources this country has in terms of both wind and solar around the country. That's both on land and even offshore. And in order to do that, we have to substantially build out the grid more than we've been doing. And there's all sorts of issues that have limited our ability to move forward with the grid. We could certainly talk about Order 1000. We talk about transmission incentives. I won't bore you with the details today. But this is something of high priority for me, I think for my colleagues as well. We have to figure out how to essentially break the juggernaut and figure out a way to encourage greater investment in these transmission facilities, especially long distance transmission facilities that will access these resources. And in order to do so, I think we're going to have to reassess some of the commission's policies on a going forward basis, and hopefully do that sooner rather than later. And then finally, the fourth priority I wanted to mention today is on something very related to transmission, which is the interconnection queue. I think everyone's well aware that a lot of these projects, and these include hybrid projects that are both solar and storage, for instance, or wind and storage, they stay in these interconnection queues forever. And there's study after study. And then when they make it through the queue process, in order to interconnect, they have to pay substantial amounts for network upgrades. In some cases, those upgrades, or facility upgrades, in some cases, those upgrades have benefit well beyond that particular generator. But the generator, at least the one first in line, usually has to pay for most of those interconnection costs. And that leads to a bunch of inefficiencies and causes a lot of generation projects and storage projects not to be built, and also delays the movement towards cleaner generation, again, allowing older, less efficient generation to stay online longer as the transmission queue grows longer and longer. So we're going to have to do something about that. I know the commission has on a couple of occasions addressed those issues in terms of interconnection reform. And certainly I think we've made some progress there, but there's a long way to go. And I think we need to really gin up what the commission's working on in order to expedite the process. So with regard, those are really the four issues I wanted to mention. I just wanted to briefly say as well, I really value the relationship we've had with the Energy Storage Association, with Jason and the team there, and I hope to continue that. We have an open door now. Admittedly, our open door policy under COVID is a little different. We don't actually have doors that have people walk through anymore, but certainly anytime any of you want to have a discussion with us or through the association or otherwise, please let us know. I think the best way for us to learn about your technology, about your concerns about the markets, is for us to have an ongoing dialogue, and we've been doing that to date, but I encourage you to keep it up going into the future. So with that, I'll open it up for conversation.
All right. Oh, thank you, Rich. You've already displayed an expansive set of priorities, and it would be an understatement to say that the expectations on FERC right now, outside of FERC, are even higher, probably the highest that certainly I can remember, with so many stakeholders asking FERC to do so much. How are you prioritizing and sequencing the work ahead? Does the staff have the literal hours in the day to take this all on?
So first of all, about the staff, I want to say we have, and I know every agency probably says this, but it's really true for FERC. And I think for those of you that have interacted with them, we have the most professional the brightest and the most dedicated staff of, I think, any government agency. And I've worked in a couple agencies. This one in particular, FERC, is top notch. And so they are very committed to the mission and are willing to do whatever work is necessary, which is great for me to hear and for my colleagues to hear as well. We do have a lot of priorities. As I mentioned, I just listed 4. We have a number of others, and there is a lot of focus and attention, as you mentioned, Jason, on the commission and expectations. And I want to temper them a little bit because it does take a little time. And with any particular issue that goes before FERC, you always have to get a majority of votes before you can move forward with something. And so we will endeavor to do that. And I think, I've had a number of good discussions with our colleagues. I really like the other 4 commissioners we have. I think we have a really good group, and I think we're going to be able to work well together and hopefully move forward. But commissioners aren't robots; they all have different opinions, and so we're going to have to work with them and make sure that we can come to an agreement on a number of these very important matters. I would say about prioritizing among the priorities. I think what we're going to try to do is lay out a plan in the near future. Hopefully, we'll speak a little bit about it at the next FERC meeting, which I believe is on February 18th. Laying out a little bit of an approach of how we intend to move forward with some of these, and we want to move forward right out of the gate and see what we can get done as quickly as possible.
Well, we are very excited to hear more about that. Just to sort of move to at least some of the topics that you've discussed here today, your interest in revisiting the capacity market rules, again, recognizing you may have matters before you that you're not going to speak to. I think one of the questions that, PJM, for example, has recently announced to its stakeholders that it's beginning a stakeholder consultation to consider capacity market design changes. I think partly in recognition of the continuing challenges, even after FERC's previous orders around MOPR. So do you think that the market operators themselves can resolve the state policy and price formation tension through their own independent reforms? Or do you think FERC's orders kind of invariably put the responsibility on FERC to take some action to resolve it? Or is this really just a matter where Congress has to step in for this to get solved?
So first of all, I think the PJM meetings that you referenced, I think are a good example. I'm sorry, my cat just jumped on me, but are a good example of what I said earlier about these. I think everyone realizes that these approaches that the FERC has approved in the last several years just aren't sustainable. We're seeing similar discussions in New York and New England as well among some of the key stakeholders. So I do think they're going to work hard and try to come up with something. And each RTO has very intricate stakeholder processes, and there's each RTO has different requirements in terms of how things are voted on and how they're presented to the commission. If there's an agreement among the stakeholders, if there's not, they have to go through a whole different process in each region. I'm hopeful that they will be able, that the stakeholders will be able to come to us with various proposals, and not to get too wonky, although I understand this is going to be very wonky. But if a proposal is submitted to FERC under Section 205 of the Federal Power Act, as opposed to Section 206, which is really the commission acting on its own or pursuant to a complaint, it's a different standard of review. It's a little bit easier for us to move forward with something that's presented from the RTOs where there's sufficient consensus about moving forward. So I'm hopeful that the RTOs will be, and the stakeholders will be able to come up with proposals to move in a much better direction than they have. If they don't, certainly the commission has the authority and the ability, as we've seen in the last couple of years. A lot of these orders didn't come from, they came from either complaints or they came even from the commission's own decisions. At times, FERC imposed ideas that no one had even proposed to us, which I thought was incredibly extreme. And that to me, that's very problematic. And if we have to, as a last resort, step in and we can get the votes to do it, we will. But I would certainly encourage the regions to move forward first. Lastly, you had mentioned Congress, and I want to touch on that just briefly. So the Federal Power Act to me is already very clear, which is one of the reasons I think that these particular orders that FERC issued probably won't survive in the courts anyway. Congress has said the states, not FERC, decide what the generation resource mix should be in their particular states. And so the states have been doing that, and FERC is trying to block that, in my opinion. FERC has in the past tried to block it. And so I think the law is very clear. I don't think anything needs to be revised in the Federal Power Act to allow us to move forward As a matter of fact, I think we need to move forward in a way that honors what Congress has already told us.
Got it. Yeah, no, I think that obviously the folks in the industry are trying to figure out, how to work within the confines as well as what's ahead, the uncertainty obviously associated with that, making it challenging for folks. But, at the same time, something that was raised at a previous policy forum by, I believe, Mike DeSocio of New York ISO, is raising New York ISO's effort, not before the commission right now, but still, I think, in the stakeholder process, on greenhouse gas pricing in the markets to be a way to resolve this. Not asking you to make a ruling, but at least, from your understanding of it, and certainly the investigation of the commission, is greenhouse gas pricing in markets actually a potential pathway for resolving these tensions, or is that really more of a separate consideration?
In my view, it's a separate consideration. I think you probably know that we had a technical conference on this on greenhouse gas pricing in the various RTOs. I think it was in September of this past year. I'm pretty sure it was September, and it was enormous interest. I think we had the most folks tune in that we had ever had for a technical conference, and there was a lot of good discussion back and forth during the conference, which lasted a good 10 or 11 hours. I blame Chairman Chatterjee at the time for stuffing all the different panels, but it was really good discussion and very helpful. And I think what came out of that was a policy statement, and the policy statement essentially said that from a FERC perspective, if one or more states in an RTO develop some sort of a carbon pricing regime, that we will attempt to accommodate that regime in the wholesale pricing in the markets that we have jurisdiction over. And but to date, no state has done that, and we're still waiting to see how the states move forward on that, and if they do, we'll hopefully make an effort to accommodate them under various rules that we oversee. But I know that some people have suggested, well, if you have a carbon price, then essentially that gives FERC free rein to go forward and say, well, you can still MOPR other subsidized assets because they're already getting the benefit of the carbon price. They're already addressing climate change that way. So therefore, we can still go forward with a MOPR. And I have some concerns with that. One, again, I don't think the law permits that, as I mentioned earlier. And two, it's not entirely clear what carbon price we're talking about. What if one state thinks that the carbon price in a particular region is insufficient, and that then the state would say, well, I'm going to have an RPS on top of that because I think I need to have more clean energy than the carbon price is going to get at. And I don't think the commission has the authority then to block that particular state program. So in my view, carbon pricing is very important and a good policy, and states may decide they don't need anything else if they have carbon pricing, but that's up to them, not for FERC.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I mean, speaking of state, federal, or FERC tensions, another one that arises in the context of energy storage has traditionally been what came out of Order 841 and the challenge there to providing a pathway for distribution connected resources. Order 2222, kind of following in those treads, making very clear that there needs to be a pathway for DER aggregations. Certainly, we see that as being a significant compliance effort for the RTOs over the course of the next year. Many storage industry members that I have talked to are worried that state regulators and distribution utilities can actually determine really the fate of how this order will do something or not do something by choosing whether and to what extent to coordinate and harmonize their rules. Issues like interconnection at the distribution level. What do you say to industry members about those fears, or are those fears maybe overblown or unfounded?
Well, first of all, I understand the concerns, and in more specifically in Order 2222, we specifically said that the interconnection process, we disclaimed jurisdiction over the interconnection process. So if a distributed energy resource is trying to interconnect to the distribution system, that's for FERC. I mean, I'm sorry, that's for the states. If they were to interconnect to the wholesale system, that's a different, to the interstate transmission system, that's a different story. And it's an attempt to essentially address some of the concerns the states have raised. I want to say the states have had they've raised a legitimate concern that the more DERs you place on the system, or even from the behind the meter storage, even if under the storage rule, they had expressed significant concern that they have their role is to make sure that the distribution system is reliable, and they were upset because FERC denied the state's request to have an opt-out, essentially where the states could say, my utilities or my distribution assets in my state cannot participate in this market. And we said, no, that's not the right policy. It's not the right approach here. We want to allow everyone to participate because it makes markets more efficient and competitive. But we also wanted to reach out to them and say, hey, we understand your concern about interconnections. So they still have that role in interconnections. Like I said, I understand that folks might like to have it all under FERC because the states could maybe block, or they might be able to use that interconnection authority to block access to the wholesale market. So we'll be taking a look at that, and if we have to step in, we will. But I do think that most states are going to take their responsibilities on interconnection and reliability seriously and limit it to that. And if not, we'll continue the dialogue with them and see if we need to move forward. But I think where we started off is a good approach, and it leaves the states some wiggle room with regard to their what I think is a legitimate role in ensuring distribution system reliability.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think there's also just a lot of wait and see, like how much we don't know, right? Like, can you bring facial concerns when it hasn't yet even been implemented? We'll see, I suppose. I want to move on to a couple of hot topics inside the energy storage industry that are matters of commission interest. Certainly, I think a lot of folks in the industry were very excited by FERC's data request on hybrid resources that was issued recently, asking all of the wholesale grid operators to effectively file, and I think sometime this summer, just how they deal with the interconnection, market participation, and capacity accreditation of those assets. What considerations do you expect to have in mind when deciding, once you've received that information and obviously the input of stakeholders, whether or not a rulemaking is appropriate at that particular juncture? What might make you think it's appropriate, for example, to let it's not 1,000 flowers, it's really 6 flowers, but let 6 flowers bloom in terms of folks developing their own paths in each market versus when it's necessary to say, no, we need to have a nationwide standard here.
So we're going to take obviously a serious look and a long look at the responses we received, not only from the RTOs and ISOs, but also from stakeholders as well in terms of their comments. And because, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of our primary roles is to address barriers. And I listed the items that we've addressed so far. But to me, the 2 areas that we still probably have additional work to do on are 1, hybrid technologies, and 2, offshore wind. I'll talk about offshore wind another day. But for hybrid projects, obviously storage and solar, storage and wind, storage, it could be storage and natural gas for that matter. There are, I know some concerns have been raised about the interconnection process in particular, especially when you add storage after you've already gotten to the queue as a generation project, for instance. That's something I think we need to take a look at. And then on the market, are there rules that make it more difficult for hybrid projects to receive capacity valuations, or just to participate, in particular energy market programs and so on? I know that some RTOs are further along on some of these issues, California, for instance, than others. But to me, I know that there are significant, substantial concerns have been raised. And like I said, I think the best thing to do, and I applaud Chairman Danley for moving forward with this, is to, again, create the record. And we had a technical conference on this already, but I think once we get the reports back from the RTOs and after we had a chance to review all the other stakeholder comments, my guess is we're going to need to move forward with something, but I don't want to prejudge that matter until we actually see the entire record.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that, this is one of those interesting things where from my vantage point, I see, in some ways the same setup as what went into Order 841, right? There was a sense of, hey, storage doesn't have a real framework for how it's going to go on the grid and participate. Data request, figure out like what's going on, and then putting together like a sense of, okay, here's some best practice that we think makes sense. The difference then certainly was that only really one market had moved forward and everyone else was doing zero, which was part of the reason why ESA was so active on this issue at the time. Now I think with the hybrid resources, I would actually think that it seems like almost every single one has some sort of update in the works. And so I think that's, not that I'm asking you to comment one way or the other, but from my vantage point, I see that as maybe one of the main interesting differences here is that there is, it seems like, active work happening from a variety of different market standpoints. So we'll see obviously when the data requests come, because I mean, some of us in the industry also just want to have a clear understanding of how things are supposed to work in various places. But I think that makes for a very interesting terrain compared to sort of the analog of storage in 841 previously. Moving on to another hot topic that folks in our industry are particularly interested in. Certainly, there's an enormous amount of work to do on transmission. I know there's a lot of discussion about whether to poke the Order 1000 hornet's nest or not. This is obviously much more of a, I would say, I don't want to call it parochial issue, but certainly an issue that has made its intersection with that conversation sort of interesting is the storage as transmission, an issue that has only really recently become before the commission. And it's clear that disagreements over whether it can be transmission are going to continue among, at the very least, among stakeholders, right? At what point do you think FERC has a responsibility to try and settle those disputes as opposed to sort of one by one, case by case determinations? Do you see larger unresolved issues over transmission planning, the role of NTAs as sort of setting stakeholders up to fight on this topic? Or do you think storage as transmission questions can actually be separated from those larger issues and resolved?
So first of all, I know that we've been, as you say, addressing these issues on a case-by-case basis, and that has been problematic for several reasons. And in large part, and the point you make is that we really haven't provided enough clarity. We've had a couple of cases. We haven't always been consistent in our decision-making, I think. And because of that, folks that want to invest a significant amount of money in a project they think might be transmission, they don't really have a good sense of whether they're going to succeed or not at FERC. So I think it's incumbent upon us, first of all, to create a clearer set of either rules or an outline what the commission, the majority of the commission at least, thinks might satisfy or might qualify as transmission from a storage facility perspective. And whether that means we need to do a rulemaking or whether we can do it through an order or a set of orders where we make it clear what our expectation is going on a going forward basis. I think that still remains to be seen how we decide to move forward. But I'm very committed to at least providing that clarity. I mean, there are some very interesting issues that, quite frankly, I've been struggling with, and I think my colleagues have as well. For instance, what do you do when the storage facility isn't acting as transmission? Can that storage facility participate in the energy markets? Or, what if the storage facility, if you're going through a transmission planning process and you want to treat storage as transmission, what does that mean for all the other non-transmission alternatives? Are they being discriminated against? There's a variety of other, I jotted down some thoughts earlier. And, I think one of the issues we had more recently in an order related to MISO is, do you have to give up operational control of your storage facility in order to achieve, in order to be treated by FERC as transmission? Those are all issues that we haven't been very clear on. We've again, addressing this on a one-off basis and not really providing much clarity for you all. So that's my goal, is to figure out how we can do that. We obviously have to come to agreement on it. These issues, I want to make it clear from my perspective, they're not easy. I've been struggling with them. I've been talking to my advisors on that, on these issues for a while now, and I think the other commissioners have as well. So hopefully we'll do better in the future, providing some more guidance, but we need to work through some pretty tricky issues.
I hear you on that. Certainly we at ESA, with the input of our very diverse membership, put forward our own sort of attempt at what we can see as a broadly representative industry position, our policy statements on storage as transmission. And I think all I can say is I feel your pain, but I also want to say that I think this is an enormous potential market opportunity, and one of the reasons why I also get very animated about storage as transmission is particularly as we see a number of the longer duration storage technologies under development coming into maturity, that you see a new kind of application that shorter durations may not have been necessarily considered as appropriate for. And so there's a really interesting thing happening where there is a technology innovation driver here that's making this conversation more and more germane as time goes forward. Meow.
Yeah, you heard that. Sorry. Yeah, just to finish up that point, I was talking earlier about the need to we need to build out the grid. Pretty significant. That's going to take billions and billions of dollars of investments. Technologies like storage, other non-transmission alternatives, actually utilizing our existing grid more efficiently. Those are all ways that we can cut down the cost of that and still achieve some of the significant benefits associated with having a more robust grid. So I understand the point.
All right. One of my meatiest, favoriteest topics, market design, which is hard. Between energy storage and demand response, electricity markets now have two very powerful tools for flexibility to support a clean energy mix. What market design changes do you think would be most important for FERC or for the RTOs themselves to explore for better valuing and compensating the flexibility that storage and demand response provide? Is this a matter of regularizing dispatchable demand? Is it about relying more on scarcity-based pricing rather than reserve products? Shorter intervals for scheduling and dispatch? I don't expect answers here, because if we had the answers, everyone would feel like we know what to do. But it feels like the shape of the world depends on where you stand.
So I'm going to speak more conceptually here and try to sidestep some of those very, very interesting and important points. But when I first got to FERC, we were in the middle of addressing the whole, if you recall, right, the Secretary Perry proposal on resilience, and we spent a lot of time talking about baseload generation. We just need to have a lot of baseload generation to make the grid more reliable, which, when you think about it, isn't accurate, because we're clearly putting aside what the federal government's going to do, but from the states and the utilities and the consumers and so on, we're clearly moving to a system where we have a lot more variability. And that's really, to me, that's the concern. It's not whether you need more baseload generation, it's how do you address variability and intermittency. And clearly storage, but other technologies as well, are well positioned to try to answer that question. But to me, the markets are still too focused on the old thought process, the old from Secretary Perry on thought process. And we need to focus more on what we need going into the future. And that means, how do we ensure that generation that addresses variability, or I should say any technologies that address variability, are adequately compensated for the value they provide the grid? And in some cases, in many cases, they're not sufficiently compensated for that value because of the old way of thinking about it. So we kind of have to try to address, or try to put forward a new paradigm in terms of how these markets reward the benefits that technologies that address variability provide. And that might require, be a many-year effort to do that. But I think it's worth taking a look at, because I think right now we're headed down a path where people are going to keep on raising concerns. And I think a lot of it is because of our market designs.
Yeah, no, I can't help but nod along when you say this could take many years, because I think that there is definitely a lot of thought work, not simply just again, it seems like there are many different paths to this potential objective of being able to provide some way to have the economic price signals that competitive markets are supposed to supply to value flexibility. And just it's interesting to see the stakeholder communities of which we are a part having very different discussions depending on where you stand. So hopefully there will be an opportunity to sometime in the next couple of years bring some of those perspectives together, at least for talking, not necessarily knowing what's going to happen next. All right, you were previously on the Hill in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, given all the things we're talking about, if you had a magic pen, what's one thing you might update in, say, the Federal Power Act, or for that matter, any other aspect of congressional legislation that bears on FERC's work?
Well, the first thing I can think of is increase the commissioner salaries. That might help. But beyond that, and I'm just joking, by the way, for the don't take it too seriously. But there's several items I could think of. The first, the one that I think may be most important, and it's more difficult to figure out exactly what Congress should do, is the need to readdress the kind of the line that's been drawn between state and federal. Obviously, we've been talking about DER aggregation and storage behind the meter and so on. And I think it's important to recognize that the lines that Congress drew back in 1935 when it enacted the second part of the Federal Power Act just aren't really rational anymore. And so I think it would be really helpful. It would be helpful for the states. It would be helpful for FERC as well, for Congress to take another look at that and figure out where to better draw the lines. And I'm not sure exactly the answer to that, but I think we need to recognize that a lot of behind the meter activity is impacting the wholesale rates. And the courts have said if something's impacting wholesale rates, FERC has some jurisdiction over it, but there's still a lot of tension there between FERC and the states. I think it would be better to have some more clarity.
Got it. Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of us are looking to Congress to try and provide much in terms of clarity about what the next few years are going to hold for us. But certainly, you know, the work that you and your colleagues and the other commissioners are doing at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is, to many members of our industry, both critical and also oftentimes leading the conversation that we're seeing across other parts of the government and in different levels of government. So, you know, we really appreciate the work that you are doing and that your colleagues are doing on this. And, you know, if you could say one thing that, you know, the industry should be bearing in mind as you all are doing your work to be helpful, or ways in which we can be helpful to you, would love to hear it.
Well, I think we're going to be tackling some pretty significant issues in the near term and the medium term. And I would say that, yeah, we're open for ideas. Please participate, as you all do anyway, but participate in all the proceedings that we have. Make sure your comments are filed. But in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, please come on in, not just with me, but we have 2 new commissioners and we have 2 other commissioners. And I think it's important for you to come in and educate all of us on the technological develops that are going on and the other issues impacting the industry. And I think we learn from that, but also I think it provides us with important ideas as we move forward.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Glick, for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to address us. And we very much look forward to doing exactly that.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Cheers. All right, everyone. I believe I just revealed what a nerd I am for power market design, and that's not an accident. After all, storage got its first economics in markets, and it's the energy asset of the grid that is single-handedly changing what power systems are capable of. So that sophistication of storage industry members and markets is part of why we're also leaders in innovation.